The vampire king had been staring at her for 3 hours when he realized he'd memorized the exact angle of her cheekbone in lamplight. Genevieve Grayson lay curled on the leather sofa in his private library, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, her breathing so steady and deep it seemed impossible she'd ever known a sleepless night. But Xerxes Bancroft knew better. He'd seen her 4 weeks ago in the 24-hour cafe near the University District, gray-faced and hollow-eyed at 3 a.m, her hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee she wasn't drinking, staring at nothing with the particular exhaustion that came from 72 hours without rest. He'd watched her from across the room. Curious at first, mortals were usually more careful about broadcasting their vulnerability at that hour, and then concerned when she'd simply sat there until dawn, broke, unmoving as though she'd forgotten how to leave. He'd approached her the second time he'd seen her there, a week later, same table, same dead-eyed stare, asked if she was all right. She looked up at him with such startled incomprehension that he'd almost retreated, but then she'd laughed a raw, painful sound and said, "Define all right." That had been the beginning. The book in Xerxes' hands was a first edition of something philosophical he'd purchased in Vienna 2 centuries ago, but he hadn't read a word in the past hour. His attention kept drifting to the woman on his sofa, to the way her fingers twitched occasionally in whatever dream she was finally, blessedly having, to the soft sounds of her breathing that had become as familiar to him as a turning of pages. Outside the tall windows, the sky was beginning to lighten from black to deep blue, and he could feel the approaching dawn in his bones, the way mortals felt a coming storm. He would have to leave soon. The library faced east, and while heavy curtains could block most of the light, he learned not to take chances with the sun. 600 years of existence had taught him that carelessness was the only thing that could truly kill an old vampire. That and heartbreak, though he'd never personally tested the latter. Genevieve shifted slightly, and Xerxes went absolutely still watching. But she didn't wake, just settled deeper into sleep, and the small smile that crossed her face made something tighten in his chest. He never intended for this to become routine. That first night, when she'd accepted his odd invitation to visit his home, "I have an extensive library, very quiet, comfortable furniture, and I'm an excellent night owl if you need company." He'd thought she'd stay an hour at most, long enough to confirm he wasn't dangerous, then leave. Instead, she'd walked into this room, looked around at the floor to ceiling shelves and the leather furniture and the low amber lighting, and said, "This is the first place I've felt calm in 6 months." Within 20 minutes, she'd been asleep on that sofa. She'd woken 4 hours later, disoriented and mortified, apologizing profusely. He'd made her tea and told her she was welcome to return whenever she needed. He had expected her to run. Mortals usually did when faced with the intensity of his attention, even when they didn't know what he was. But she'd come back the next night and the night after. And now, a month later, she arrived at his door every evening at 10 o'clock, spent an hour talking with him about anything and everything, her graduate studies in art history, his carefully edited experiences traveling the world, her family, his books, and then she'd curl up on that sofa while he read aloud to her, and within minutes, she'd be deeply, peacefully asleep. And Xerxes would sit exactly where he was now, in the wing-back chair across from her, and he would watch over her rest as though it were the most important task he'd ever been given. He didn't know what it meant that her presence had become the centerpiece of his nights. He'd lived for 6 centuries, ruled the eastern court of vampires for 4 of them, commanded armies and negotiated treaties and executed enemies without hesitation. He'd taken lovers and dismissed them when the shine wore off, attended glittering parties and palaces and hunting lodges, accumulated wealth and knowledge and power until he was one of the most feared vampires in the modern world. And somehow, watching this exhausted mortal woman sleep in his library had become more meaningful than any of it. The sky outside was shifting from blue to pale gray, 15 minutes, maybe 20, before the sun broke the horizon. Xerxes carefully closed his book and set it aside, then rose from his chair with the preternatural silence his kind had perfected over millennia. He moved to the window and drew the heavy curtains fully closed, checking for gaps, then moved to the door. He paused there, one hand on the frame, and looked back. Genevieve had shifted again, her face now turned toward where he'd been sitting, as though even in sleep she'd tracked his movement. Her dark hair had fallen across her forehead, and he had the sudden, sharp urge to cross the room and brush it back, to feel for himself the warmth of her skin, the realness of her. He didn't. He never touched her when she slept. though he wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps because it felt too intimate, too presumptuous. Perhaps because some part of him knew that if he started touching her, he wouldn't want to stop. Instead, he memorized the line of her jaw, the curve of her shoulder, the way her hand had relaxed open against the leather. He stored it all away with the hundreds of other details he'd collected over these weeks, building a catalog of her that he reviewed during the daylight hours when he was locked in his bedroom in the windowless heart of the house, waiting for night to fall again. Then he left, pulling the door closed behind him with the softest click. He was halfway down the corridor when he heard footsteps and turned to find Lysander, his second in command, approaching with the purposeful stride that meant court business. Lysander was ancient even by vampire standards, his white hair bound back in a style that had been fashionable during the Byzantine Empire, and his pale face set in its usual expression of mild disapproval. He stopped a respectful distance away and inclined his head. "My king," he said, his voice carrying the faint accent of a dozen dead languages. "The council is requesting an audience." "At dawn?" Xerxes kept walking, forcing Lysander to follow. "How dramatic of them. They have concerns about your recent activities." Xerxes didn't need to ask what activities. His entire court knew about Genevieve by now, knew that he spent every night locked in his library with a mortal woman, refusing visitors, postponing decisions, letting correspondence pile up unanswered. He'd been avoiding the council summons for 2 weeks, but apparently his patience had run out simultaneously with theirs. "Tell them I'll meet with them tomorrow night," he said. "After." "After what, my king?" "After she wakes." Lysander was silent for a long moment. They'd reached the entrance to the underground levels, where Xerxes' private chambers lay far from any possibility of sunlight, and Xerxes paused with his hand on the heavy door. "Xerxes," Lysander said, dropping the formality in the way he only did when they were alone, and he was genuinely worried. "They're calling it servitude. They're saying you're debasing yourself by attending a mortal sleep like a common guard. Then they're fools who've forgotten what it means to care about something beyond their own pride. They're not wrong that this is unprecedented. A king does as he pleases," Xerxes interrupted, his voice hardening into the tone that had ended arguments and rebellions for 400 years. "That's rather the definition of being king." Lysander met his gaze for a long moment, then bowed. "As you say, my lord, I'll inform the council you'll receive them tomorrow evening." Xerxes descended into the darkness of the underground, feeling the weight of the earth between him and the rising sun, and tried not to think about how Lysander's words had struck closer to truth than he wanted to admit. What was he doing? Why did it matter so much that Genevieve could sleep in his presence? Why had watching over her rest become more important than ruling his court? He reached his chambers and locked the door behind him, sealing himself into the cool darkness. His bedroom was spare and elegant, furnished with pieces from a dozen different centuries, and he moved through it without needing light, his vampire senses rendering the darkness as clear as day. He lay down on the bed, fully clothed, and closed his eyes, though he wouldn't sleep. Vampires didn't sleep the way mortals did, not really. They could enter a meditative state that conserved energy, but it wasn't rest, not in the way Genevieve rested. It was simply waiting for night to return. And as he waited, he thought about her face, peaceful and unguarded, and he wondered what it meant that he could recall every detail with perfect clarity, as though he'd been studying a masterwork he was terrified of losing. When Genevieve woke, the library was full of soft afternoon light filtered through heavy curtains, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory returned Xerxes' house, his library, the deep leather sofa that had somehow become the only place in the world she could truly rest, and she sat up slowly, disoriented by the hour. She had slept past noon. Again. She should have felt guilty about that, about trespassing on his hospitality for so many hours, but the bone-deep relief of having actually slept overrode everything else. 6 months of chronic insomnia had taught her not to take rest for granted. Before she'd met Xerxes, she'd been barely functional, surviving on scattered 20-minute naps and enough caffeine to kill a small horse, her mind constantly racing with anxiety she couldn't name or control. And then she'd found this place, or he'd found her, and for reasons she still didn't fully understand, her brain had finally agreed to quiet down and let her sleep. She stood and stretched, working out the stiffness in her shoulders, and looked around the library. It was exactly as it had been when she had drifted off Xerxes' book on the side table by his chair. Her own bag tucked neatly beside the sofa, everything orderly and peaceful. The house was absolutely silent, which wasn't unusual. Xerxes had explained early on that he kept strange hours and valued his privacy, that she might not see him during the day, and she'd accepted that without question. He was eccentric and clearly wealthy enough to live exactly as he pleased, and that was fine with her. She gathered her things and made her way to the front door, letting herself out into the late afternoon sunlight. The house was in the historic district, a 3-story Victorian mansion that had been meticulously maintained, surrounded by a wall and gate that suggested someone who valued their privacy. She'd never been anywhere in it except the library, the small bathroom down the hall, and the entry foyer. She'd also never been here during daylight. Something about that felt transgressive, like she was seeing something private, though she couldn't articulate why. Her apartment was a 20-minute walk away, close enough that she didn't need to drive, and she spent the time thinking about her dissertation proposal, which was due in a week and which she'd actually made progress on now that her brain was functional again. The restoration of Gothic architecture in the 19th century wasn't exactly thrilling cocktail party conversation, but it fascinated her. All those romantic ruins and deliberate decay, beauty preserved through careful attention. Rather like Xerxes' house, actually, carefully maintained history. She smiled at the thought and wondered, not for the first time, what his story was. He spoke like someone educated in a dozen different traditions, referenced books and places and events with the ease of someone who'd been everywhere, and he had the kind of timeless quality that made it impossible to guess his age. 40? 50? He could have been anywhere in that range, his face unlined, but his dark eyes holding the weight of long experience. And he was beautiful, though she tried not to think about that too much. Pale skin that seemed almost luminous in lamplight, white hair that fell to his shoulders, features that were sharp and aristocratic and utterly compelling. The first time she'd seen him, she'd thought he looked like something out of a pre-Raphaelite painting, too perfect to be entirely real. But he was real, and he was kind in a way that felt genuine rather than performative, and he'd given her the gift of sleep without asking for anything in return. That night, she arrived at his door at 10 o'clock exactly, and he answered immediately as though he'd been waiting. "Genevieve," he said, and something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. He seemed tense, the usual calm reserve in his expression slightly strained. "Please, come in." She followed him to the library, noticing the way he moved fluid and precise like a dancer or a martial artist, and settled into her usual spot on the sofa, while he took his chair across from her. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "All." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze focused on her with an intensity that made her skin warm. "I need to speak with you about something," he said finally. "About this arrangement." Her stomach dropped. "Oh, if I've overstayed my welcome." "No." The word was sharp, almost harsh, and he seemed to catch himself, his expression softening. "No, that's not what I meant. You're welcome here, Genevieve. You'll always be welcome. But my household has concerns about the amount of time we're spending together." "Your household?" She hadn't known he had staff. She'd never seen or heard anyone else in the house. "My associates," he amended. "I have business obligations I've been neglecting, and they're worried that I'm prioritizing your comfort over my responsibilities." "Then I should stop coming," she said immediately, even though the thought made her chest tight. "I don't want to cause problems for you." "That's not what I want." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and she noticed for the first time that his hands were clasped tight enough that his knuckles were bloodless. "I want you here, Genevieve. I look forward to your arrival every evening. Watching you find peace here has become..." He paused, seeming to search for words. "Important to me." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning she wasn't sure she understood. "It's important to me, too," she said quietly. "I don't know why I can sleep here when I can't anywhere else, but this is the only place I feel safe enough to let go." His expression shifted, something fierce and protective crossing his face. "You are safe here," he said. "I would never allow harm to come to you." "I know." And she did know, which was strange because she barely knew him, but some instinct deeper than logic trusted him completely. "Then will you let me propose something?" He straightened, his hands finally relaxing. "What if you stayed later, or even spent the night? I have guest rooms on the second floor. You could sleep properly without needing to wake and return home." She should have said no, should have maintained boundaries, kept this strange arrangement from becoming even stranger. But the thought of sleeping through an entire night, of not waking in her own apartment at 3 a.m. with her heart racing and her mind spiraling, that was too tempting to refuse. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I'm certain." His voice was firm, final. "I'll show you the room now if you'd like. You can keep things here, make it comfortable, whatever you need." So she followed him up the curved staircase to the second floor, down a hallway lined with closed doors to a bedroom that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel antique furniture, soft carpets, a 4-poster bed with heavy curtains, and tall windows that overlooked the garden. "It's beautiful," she said, genuine awe in her voice. "I'm glad you like it." He moved to the windows and showed her how the curtains could be drawn completely closed, blocking all light. "If you prefer darkness when you sleep, or they can be left open, whatever helps." She realized he'd thought this through, had considered what she might need, and something warm bloomed in her chest. "Thank you, Xerxes. This is incredibly generous." He turned to face her, and in the lamplight his eyes looked almost silver. "It's not generosity," he said quietly. "It's selfishness. I want you close." The words sent heat through her, and she had to look away from the intensity of his gaze. "I should probably examine why I'm so comfortable with this arrangement," she said, aiming for lightness. "Most people would think this is strange." "Most people haven't lived with insomnia," he replied, "and most people don't understand what it means to find something rare and necessary." She looked back at him, caught by the weight in his voice. "Is that what this is?" "For me? Yes." He moved toward the door, giving her space. "I'll leave you to settle in. Join me in the library when you're ready." That night, she fell asleep on the sofa as usual. Xerxes reading aloud from something in what sounded like Old French, his voice a low rumble that wrapped around her like a blanket. And when she woke, in the early hours of the morning, needing the bathroom, she found herself in that guest bedroom upstairs, tucked under soft blankets she didn't remember, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. He must have carried her. The thought should have alarmed her, but instead she felt cared for, protected, and she drifted back to sleep with a smile on her face. The next evening, Xerxes faced his council in the formal receiving room deep underground, where the weight of stone above them was a reminder of how long their kind had survived by staying hidden, staying careful. There were 7 of them seated in a semicircle before him, all ancient, all powerful, all wearing expressions ranging from concern to outright hostility. Lysander stood at his right hand, silent and watchful. "My king," began Vasilika, the eldest of them, her white hair coiled in elaborate braids and her pale face sharp with disapproval. "We must speak plainly. Your behavior with this mortal girl is becoming scandalous." "Scandalous," Xerxes repeated, letting ice creep into his voice. "Please elaborate." "You spend every night in her company," said Dragon, a warrior who'd once commanded armies and now oversaw the court's security. "You carry her to bed like a servant. You neglect your duties, postpone important decisions, refuse audiences. This is beneath you. What I choose to do with my time is my concern, not yours. It becomes our concern when it affects the court's stability," Vasilika said. "You're the king, Xerxes. Your actions set precedent. If you debase yourself by serving a mortal's whims, I'm not serving her whims." His voice could have cut glass. "I'm providing protection and comfort to someone who needs it." "She's mortal," Dragon said flatly. "She'll be dead in a handful of decades. Why does she matter?" Xerxes was across the distance between them before Dragon could blink, his hand at the warrior's throat, not squeezing, but present, a promise. "Because I say she matters," he said softly, dangerously, "and if you question my judgment again, you'll learn exactly how long a handful of decades can feel when you're imprisoned underground." He released Dragon and stepped back, feeling the tension in the room ratchet higher. Lysander hadn't moved, but his posture had shifted to ready, prepared to intervene if necessary. "This is precisely the problem," Vasilika said, her voice sharp. "You're losing perspective, threatening a council member over a mortal you barely know." "I know her well enough." Xerxes forced himself to stillness, to calm. "And I know myself well enough to understand that what I feel for her is not something I'm willing to surrender to satisfy your sense of propriety." Silence greeted that admission. Finally, Lysander spoke, his voice carefully neutral. "My king, perhaps the council's concern is not about the woman herself, but about the nature of your relationship with her. A king who watches over a mortal's sleep night after night, it suggests a power imbalance. It suggests you're placing yourself in a position of servitude rather than partnership. She doesn't know what I am, Xerxes said, the words bitter in his mouth. She thinks I'm an eccentric mortal with unusual hours and kind impulses. So how can there be partnership when she doesn't know the truth? Then tell her, Vasilika said. If she matters so much, reveal yourself. Let her make an informed choice about whether she wants your attention. And if she runs? The question escaped before he could stop it, revealing more vulnerability than he'd intended. If knowing the truth destroys the trust she has in me, then she was never truly yours, Vasilika said, not unkindly. And you'll have lost nothing real. The council dismissed itself shortly after, leaving Xerxes alone with Lysander in the stone silence of the underground chamber. She's right, you know, Lysander said quietly, about telling her. I know. Xerxes moved to the wall, pressing his palm against cool stone, but I'm not ready to lose what we have, even if it's built on incomplete truth. It's not fair to her, keeping this secret. I'm aware. And it's not fair to you either. You're guarding her sleep, but you're not allowing yourself to be vulnerable in return. You're still holding yourself apart, still playing the role of protector rather than partner. Xerxes closed his eyes. I haven't been vulnerable in 400 years. I'm not sure I remember how. Then perhaps, Lysander said gently, that's something she can teach you. That night, Genevieve arrived at his door carrying an overnight bag, and the sight of it, the concrete evidence that she was staying, that she trusted him enough to sleep under his roof, made something fierce and possessive rise in Xerxes' chest. They fell into their routine, settling into the library, talking about her research and his recent reading. She told him about her family, about growing up in the Midwest with 2 younger brothers and parents who loved her, but didn't quite understand her obsession with art and history. He told her about traveling through Europe in the 19th century, carefully editing the details to sound like he'd studied the period rather than lived through it, and watching the Gothic revival transform landscapes and architecture. It must be strange, she said thoughtfully, curled into her corner of the sofa, living in a house this old, knowing that so much history happened in these walls. It's comforting, he said honestly. Permanence in a world that changes too quickly. Do you ever want things to change? Or do you prefer keeping everything exactly as it's always been? The question struck deeper than she knew. I used to resist change, he admitted, but lately I'm finding that some changes are worth embracing. She smiled at that, soft and warm, and Xerxes felt the weight of everything he wasn't telling her pressing against his chest. Tell her. Vasilika's voice echoed in his memory. If she matters, reveal yourself, but not tonight. Tonight he wanted to watch her fall asleep in the lamplight, wanted to memorize the trust in her face as her eyes drifted closed, wanted to preserve this fragile piece a little longer before he risked shattering it. She fell asleep listening to him read from Tolstoy, her breathing evening out in that particular way that meant she truly let go of consciousness, and Xerxes set the book aside and simply watched. The curve of her cheek, the soft part of her lips, the way her hand had fallen open against the cushion, all of it perfect, all of it necessary, all of it his to protect. When dawn approached, he carried her upstairs to the guest bedroom, moving through the dark house with preternatural silence. She was warm and soft in his arms, her head tucked against his shoulder, and he allowed himself a moment of pure selfishness as he laid her on the bed, smoothing the blankets over her, letting his fingers brush through her hair just once. Then he forced himself to leave, to retreat to his own chambers before the sun could rise and trap him. But as he lay in the darkness waiting for the day to pass, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would tell her the truth. He would risk everything, lose everything for the chance at something real. Tomorrow. Except tomorrow came, and when Genevieve arrived, she was excited about a breakthrough in her research, and he couldn't bear to dim that light in her eyes with confessions about monsters and blood and immortality. Tomorrow, he told himself again. And the day after that, she fell asleep earlier than usual, exhausted from a long day, and he couldn't wake her for something so selfish as his need to be known. Tomorrow. A week passed, then 2, and Xerxes felt the weight of his secret growing heavier, even as his feelings for Genevieve deepened into something he could no longer pretend was simple protectiveness. He was in love with her, completely, irrevocably in love in a way he hadn't been in centuries, perhaps ever. And the knowledge that she didn't truly know him couldn't make an informed choice about returning his feelings, was a constant ache beneath his ribs. The truth came out not because he chose to reveal it, but because Genevieve woke too early. It was an hour before sunset, late afternoon light still filtering through the curtains in the library, and Xerxes was so absorbed in his book that he didn't notice her stirring until she spoke. "Xerxes?" He looked up, already smiling, and then froze. She was sitting up on the sofa, rubbing her eyes, and the angle of the light through the curtains cast a single bright beam across the carpet between them, harmless to her, lethal to him. "Stay there," he said sharply, not moving from his chair. "Don't come closer." She blinked, confused. "What?" "Why..." And then, as though the universe had decided the time for secrets was over, a gap in the curtain shifted and the beam of sunlight widened, stretching toward his chair. Xerxes moved with vampire speed, too fast for mortal eyes to track, crossing to the window and yanking the curtains fully closed. But in that instant of movement, Genevieve had registered the inhuman speed, the desperate avoidance of sunlight, the way he'd moved like liquid shadow rather than flesh. He turned to face her and found her pressed back against the sofa, her eyes wide with shock. "What are you?" she whispered, the question he'd been dreading, the moment everything changed. "I think you already know," he said quietly. She shook her head, but it was denial rather than disagreement. "That's not possible. Vampires aren't real. We're very real and very careful about staying hidden." He didn't move closer, giving her space. "I'm sorry you found out this way. I wanted to tell you properly." "You're a vampire." She said it like she was testing the words, seeing if they made sense. "You're actually... How is that possible?" "I don't know the science of it, only that it is. I was turned in 1425, in what's now Romania. I've been alive for 600 years. The numbers seemed to stagger her. 600? Oh my God, all those stories about traveling, about the 19th century you were there. You actually lived through all of it." "Yes." "And the house, the way you only appear at night, the fact that I've never seen you during the day." She pressed her hands to her face. "How did I not see it?" "Because people don't expect monsters to be real," Xerxes said, letting bitterness creep into his voice. "And because I've had centuries to perfect the appearance of normalcy." She lowered her hands and he braced himself for fear, for revulsion, for her to demand he take her home immediately. "Instead," she said, "are you going to hurt me?" "No." The word was absolute, unshakable. "Never. I would destroy anyone who tried to harm you, including myself, if I somehow became a threat to you." "Do you drink blood?" "Yes, from volunteers, usually other vampires or humans who know what we are and consent." "I would never take from you without permission." "Have you killed people?" He could have lied, but he'd already lied by omission for too long. "Yes, in war, in self-defense, and when I was younger and less careful about controlling my nature." "I'm not a good man, Genevieve. I'm an apex predator who's learned to coexist with humans, but that doesn't change what I am." She was quiet for a long time, her gaze searching his face. "Why did you invite me here?" she asked finally. "What do you want from me?" "At first, I wanted to understand why you were so vulnerable, broadcasting your exhaustion where anyone could see it. Then I wanted to help, because I could tell you were suffering. And now," he stopped, the confession caught in his throat. "Now?" she prompted. "Now I want you to stay because I've fallen in love with you," he said, the truth stark and unadorned. "And I know that's unfair when you didn't have all the information, when you couldn't make an informed choice about spending time with me, but it's the truth, and you deserve to know it." The silence that followed was infinite, terrible. Then Genevieve stood up, and Xerxes prepared himself for her to leave, to walk out of his life forever. Instead, she crossed the room to stand directly in front of him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, smell the soap she'd used, and the unique scent that was purely her. "I should be terrified," she said quietly. "I should run. But instead, all I can think is that this explains why I feel safe with you, why my brain finally quiets down enough to let me sleep. It's because, on some instinctive level, I know you're strong enough to protect me from anything. Genevieve." "I'm not saying I'm not scared," she interrupted. "I am. This is a lot to process, and I probably need time to really think about what it means that you're not human. But I'm not running, and I'm not going to run." Hope, fragile and strange, unfurled in his chest. "Why not?" "Because in the past 6 weeks, you've been kinder to me than almost anyone in my life. because you've asked nothing from me except the chance to watch over my sleep, which is possibly the most selfless thing anyone's ever done for me. And because," she paused, color rising in her cheeks, "because I think I'm falling in love with you too, and I'd like to see where that goes. Even if it's complicated and strange and definitely not what I expected when I walked into that cafe." Xerxes stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. "You're not afraid of me?" "I'm a little afraid of what you are," she admitted, "but I'm not afraid of who you are. There's a difference." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. Her skin was so warm against his palms, so impossibly alive. "I don't deserve you," he said roughly. "Good thing I'm not asking you to deserve me," she replied, and then she rose on her toes and kissed him. Her lips were soft and warm and tasted like the tea she'd been drinking earlier, and Xerxes felt 600 years of careful control fracture under the weight of his need for her. He kissed her back with all the restrained hunger he'd been suppressing for weeks, one hand sliding into her hair, the other wrapping around her waist to pull her closer. She made a small sound of surprise that melted into pleasure, and her hands came up to grip his shoulders, anchoring herself against him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard while she was breathing hard, he didn't technically need to breathe. She was flushed and bright-eyed and smiling. "So," she said, "what happens now?" "Now," Xerxes said, "I tell you everything. No more secrets, no more carefully edited stories. You deserve the full truth." They stayed up all night, Genevieve curled against his side on the sofa while he told her about his mortal life in 15th century Romania, about being turned by a vampire queen who'd wanted a consort, about learning to navigate immortality and eventually claiming a throne of his own. He told her about the court, about the politics and power struggles and the careful balance required to rule creatures who were all predators by nature. He told her about the moment he'd seen her in that cafe and felt something shift. Some recognition that she was important even before he'd known her name. And Genevieve listened to all of it, asking questions, processing, occasionally pressing closer when the stories grew dark. She didn't shy away from the violence or the strangeness, just absorbed it all and remained steady beside him. By the time dawn approached, she was exhausted, her questions finally trailing off into comfortable silence. You should sleep," Xerxes said, running his fingers through her hair. "You've had a rather overwhelming evening." "Will you stay with me?" she asked, looking up at him. "Not just watching from across the room, but actually with me?" The request lodged in his chest like an arrow. "Vampires don't sleep the way you do," he said carefully. "I can rest, conserve energy, but it's not the same as true sleep." "But you can rest beside me?" "Yes." "Then do that, please. I want to know what it feels like to wake up next to you." So Xerxes carried her upstairs to the guest bedroom and laid her on the bed, then stretched out beside her fully clothed, hyper-aware of every point where their bodies touched. Genevieve immediately curled into him, her head on his shoulder, one hand resting over his silent heart. "This is nice," she murmured, already drifting. "You're very comfortable for someone who's technically dead." He huffed a surprised laugh. "I'm undead, not dead. There's a distinction." Undead and very cozy." Her voice was slurring with sleep now. "Thank you for telling me the truth. Thank you for not running. I told you, not going anywhere." And then she was asleep, her breathing evening out, her body relaxing completely against his. Xerxes lay there in the darkness, feeling the warmth of her against his chest, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, the absolute trust in the way she'd surrendered to sleep in his arms. For the first time in 6 centuries, he understood what it meant to be vulnerable, to give someone the power to destroy him with a word, a choice, a change of heart, to care more about her comfort than his own safety, her happiness than his control. It was terrifying. It was also the most real thing he'd felt since his mortal death. He closed his eyes and let himself enter the meditative state that passed for vampire rest, and for the first time, it felt less like waiting and more like actually resting, because he wasn't alone. When Genevieve woke, the room was dim with late afternoon light, and Xerxes was exactly where he'd been, watching her with an expression so tender it made her breath catch. "How long have you been awake?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep. "I never fully sleep," he reminded her, "but I've been aware for about an hour." "And you just watched me?" "I memorized you," he corrected. "The way I've been doing for weeks, except this time I could also feel you breathing, feel your warmth. It's different being this close. She stretched, feeling the pleasant ache of having slept deeply and well, then shifted to face him properly. Good different or bad different? Extraordinary different. He traced his fingers along her jaw, the touch feather light. I've never felt this with anyone, Genevieve. This need to be close, to know every detail, to protect and be protected in return. Protected? She raised an eyebrow. What do you need protection from? You're 600 years old and basically indestructible. Physical protection? No, but you make me vulnerable in ways I haven't been since I was mortal. You could destroy me with a word. The admission was raw, honest, and Genevieve felt the weight of it settle over her. I won't, she said quietly. Destroy you, I mean. I know this is fast and probably crazy, but I meant what I said last night. I want to see where this goes. Even knowing what I am, especially knowing what you are, because now I understand why you've been so careful with me, why you watch over my sleep like it's the most important thing in your world. She kissed him, soft and brief. You're not a monster, Xerxes. You're just someone who's lived a very long time and learned to survive in a world that would fear you if they knew the truth. Something in his expression shifted, some tightness easing. The council would say you're being naive, that you don't understand the reality of what I am. Then maybe I should meet this council and let them explain it to me. He went very still. You want to meet them. If they're part of your life, part of your world, then yes, I want to understand all of it. They're not going to be welcoming, he warned. They already think I'm debasing myself by caring for you the way I do. Then they're idiots, Genevieve said flatly. Caring for someone isn't debasing. It's called being in a relationship. Xerxes stared at her for a long moment, then started laughing, a genuine surprised sound that made her grin. I'm not sure anyone has ever called the High Council idiots to my face, he said. This is going to be memorable. The meeting was scheduled for 3 nights later, giving Genevieve time to adjust to the reality of vampires, and for Xerxes to prepare his counsel for the fact that she knew the truth and would be attending the session. In the meantime, they fell into a new routine. Genevieve moved more of her things into the guest bedroom, turning it into something that felt like hers: books on the nightstand, her laptop on the desk, comfortable clothes in the wardrobe. She still fell asleep on the sofa in the library most nights, but now Xerxes would carry her upstairs and stay with her, resting beside her in the darkness, and she'd wake with his arms around her and feel safer than she'd ever felt in her life. He showed her more of the house, the parts he'd kept hidden before the underground levels where his chambers were, the elegant receiving rooms that spoke of old wealth and older power, the armory that made her eyes widen, because who kept actual medieval weapons in their basement? Vampires who remember when these were the height of military technology, Xerxes said dryly, watching her examine a sword that looked like it belonged in a museum. This is incredible, she breathed. Do you know how to use all of these? I was trained with most of them when I was mortal, and I've had 6 centuries to maintain those skills. He took the sword from her and moved through a brief demonstration, the blade whistling through the air with lethal grace. We're harder to kill than mortals, but we can still be destroyed. Silver, fire, decapitation, complete destruction of the heart, all effective. That's... She searched for words. Actually, kind of terrifying. It's reality. We're powerful, but not invincible. He set the sword back in its place, which is why we've survived by staying hidden, by being careful, by maintaining control over our territories and our kind. Is that what the council does? Maintain control. Among other things, they advise me on court matters, help navigate disputes between vampires, ensure we're not exposed to mortal authorities. They're also incredibly traditional and not particularly thrilled that I've fallen in love with a human. Because it's dangerous. Because it's unprecedented. Kings don't typically involve themselves intimately with mortals. The lifespan difference makes it too painful, and the power imbalance makes it complicated. But more than that, they see my attention to you as something that diminishes me rather than enhances my life. Genevieve frowned. That's ridiculous. Love doesn't diminish people. They would say that watching over your sleep, carrying you to bed, orienting my entire schedule around your comfort, that these are acts of servitude unbecoming to a king. And what do you say? Xerxes turned to face her fully, his expression serious. I say that protecting your rest is the most meaningful thing I've done in 400 years of ruling. I say that being needed by you, being trusted by you, has made me feel more alive than I have since my mortal death. And I say that if they can't understand that, then they've forgotten what it means to be connected to anything beyond power and pride. Genevieve crossed the space between them and wrapped her arms around him, pressing close. Good answer, she said against his chest. And for the record, I don't think you're serving me. I think we're building something together, even if it's strange and new and not what either of us expected. His arms came around her, holding her tight. I want that, he said quietly. Something built together, something mutual. Then that's what we'll have. The night of the council meeting, Xerxes dressed in formal clothing that looked like it came from another century, dark brocade and silver buttons. His white hair bound back with a silver clasp, and Genevieve felt suddenly underdressed in her simple black dress and boots. You look perfect, he assured her, reading her nervous expression. They're expecting me to arrive with a mortal companion. Let them see that you're confident and unafraid. I'm a little afraid, she admitted. That's wisdom, not weakness. But I'll be beside you the entire time, and I promise you're safe. They descended into the underground levels, past his chambers to a large formal room that looked like something out of a Gothic cathedral, vaulted ceilings, elaborate stonework, and 7 vampires seated in a semicircle, all of them beautiful and terrifying in the way Xerxes was beautiful and terrifying, all pale skin and white hair and ancient eyes. Xerxes led her to stand before them, his hand at the small of her back, a grounding presence. Counselors, he said formally, may I introduce Genevieve Grayson. She knows what we are, and she's chosen to remain. A woman with elaborately braided hair. Basilica, Genevieve remembered from his descriptions, leaned forward, her gaze sharp. Chosen to remain, she repeated, or been compelled to remain. I don't compel mortals, Xerxes said coldly. You know that. Then let her speak for herself. Basilica turned her attention to Genevieve. Girl, do you understand what you're involving yourself with? The nature of the creature standing beside you? Genevieve felt her spine straighten. I understand that Xerxes is a vampire, that he's 600 years old, powerful, and capable of significant violence. I also understand that he's been incredibly kind to me, that he's protected my rest when I was suffering from debilitating insomnia, and that his presence in my life has been nothing but positive. Positive now, said the warrior vampire dragon. But what happens when you age and he doesn't? When you're old and dying and he still looks as he does now? Then I'll have lived a full life with someone I love, Genevieve said steadily, which seems preferable to living a full life alone because I was too afraid to take a chance on something extraordinary. Several of the counselors exchanged glances. Lysander, who sat at the far end, was watching her with what might have been approval. You're not concerned about the power imbalance? Basilica pressed. A mortal woman involved with a vampire king, there's no way for that relationship to be equal. With respect, I think you're underestimating how much power I have, Genevieve said. Xerxes might be physically stronger and immortal, but I'm the one he's vulnerable to. I'm the one who could destroy him by leaving, who has his trust and his heart. That's not a powerless position. Xerxes' hand tightened slightly against her back, a silent message of support. Basilica studied her for a long moment, then looked at Xerxes. She's not what I expected, she said finally. She never is, Xerxes replied, and there was warmth in his voice that made Genevieve's chest tight. And you truly believe this is sustainable? Lysander asked, joining the conversation. That you can maintain a relationship with a mortal without it affecting your rule? I believe that being with Genevieve makes me a better king, not a worse one, Xerxes said, because she reminds me what it means to be connected to something beyond power, to care about someone's well-being more than my own convenience. That's not weakness, that's perspective. Dragon scoffed. Pretty words. But when faced with a choice between the court's needs and her needs, what will you choose? It would depend on the situation, Xerxes said evenly, just as any choice depends on context. But I'm not going to pretend that Genevieve's safety and happiness aren't priorities for me, because they are. If that makes me unfit to rule in your eyes, then perhaps it's time to elect a new king. The silence that followed was absolute, electric. You'd abdicate, Basilica said, and she sounded genuinely shocked. Over a mortal? I'd abdicate over the right to choose my own life, Xerxes corrected. Genevieve is part of that life now. If the court can't accept that, then we're at an impasse. That won't be necessary, Lysander said quietly, and all eyes turned to him. The king is entitled to his private life, provided it doesn't compromise court security or expose our existence. From what I've seen, this relationship does neither. If anything, it stabilized him. Stabilized? Dragon challenged. He's been less volatile, more patient in negotiations, and more willing to compromise in disputes, Lysander said. I would call that stabilization, yes. Vasilika sighed, a very human sound from a very inhuman creature. Very well. The council will not oppose your relationship with this mortal, provided she remains discreet and doesn't become a security risk. She won't, Xerxes said. You have my word. And you, Vasilika said to Genevieve, do you understand the consequences of involving yourself in our world? The danger, the secrecy, the isolation? I'm beginning to, Genevieve said honestly, but I'd rather face those consequences with Xerxes than avoid them alone. Something in Vasilika's expression softened slightly. Then I wish you good fortune, child. You're going to need it. The meeting concluded shortly after, and Xerxes led Genevieve back upstairs, his hand clasped firmly around hers. That went better than I expected, he said once they were alone in the library. They threatened your rule and called me a security risk, Genevieve pointed out. How is that better than expected? Because they didn't demand I end things with you, and they didn't try to compel you to leave. In council terms, that's a ringing endorsement. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. Thank you for standing with me, for being brave and honest and yourself. Thank you for being willing to give up your throne for me, she replied. That was either incredibly romantic or incredibly stupid, and I haven't decided which. Both, he admitted. Definitely both. But I meant it, Genevieve. I've been king for 400 years. I've done my duty, maintained peace, built a stable court. If I have to choose between that legacy and building a life with you, I'll choose you every time. She kissed him, pouring everything she felt into it, gratitude and fear and love and hope all tangled together. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. I'm not going to make you choose, she said. We'll figure out how to balance both, your court and our life together. How did I get so lucky? He murmured. By being in the right cafe at the right time and being kind to an exhausted grad student, she said. The rest was just us figuring out how to be brave. That night, she fell asleep on the sofa with Xerxes reading beside her, his voice a familiar comfort. But this time, when he carried her upstairs, he didn't just lay her in bed and rest beside her. He undressed down to his shirt and pants, making himself comfortable, and when she stirred slightly in her sleep, he whispered, I'm here. You're safe. And then, for the first time in 600 years, Xerxes Bancroft let himself truly rest. Not the meditative state that passed for vampire sleep, but actual deep rest, the kind that required trust and vulnerability and the absolute certainty that he was safe. He rested because Genevieve was beside him, her warmth and steady breathing a promise that he wasn't alone. He rested because she'd stood before his council and defended their relationship with a strength that rivaled any warrior he'd known. He rested because, for the first time since his mortal death, he had something worth resting for, something worth being vulnerable for. And when dawn came and the underground chambers were sealed against the sun, he didn't wake. He stayed in that deep, restorative rest with Genevieve's hand in his and her head on his shoulder, and he dreamed something vampires weren't supposed to be able to do of a future they could build together. The weeks that followed were an adjustment for both of them. Genevieve finished her dissertation proposal and began serious research, which meant long days in libraries and archives. Xerxes managed court business and navigated the delicate politics of vampire society, always with one eye on the clock, waiting for evening when Genevieve would return. They learned each other's rhythms. Genevieve discovered that Xerxes was meticulous about his routines, that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged once he was comfortable, that he collected first editions with the enthusiasm of someone who'd actually known the authors. Xerxes learned that Genevieve talked to herself when she was working, that she had a weakness for terrible reality television, that she was fiercely loyal to the people she loved and utterly ruthless in defending them. They had their first real argument about a month after the council meeting, when Xerxes tried to rearrange her schedule to accommodate a court event, and she pointed out sharply that she had her own life and responsibilities that didn't revolve around his convenience. I wasn't trying to control you, he'd said, defensive. Then, don't make decisions about my time without consulting me, she'd replied. I know you're used to giving orders and having them followed, but I'm not one of your subjects. They'd stood there in tense silence, and then Xerxes had said quietly, You're right, I apologize. Old habits. Old habits from being an absolute monarch for 400 years? Something like that. They'd talked it through, established boundaries and expectations, and by the end of it, Genevieve understood a little more about how hard it was for him to share control. And Xerxes understood that loving someone meant adapting, compromising, meeting in the middle. It wasn't always easy. There were nights when Genevieve was exhausted from her research and fell asleep before they could have their usual conversation. And Xerxes would watch her with something like grief because he'd missed talking to her. There were nights when court business kept him trapped in meetings until dawn, and Genevieve would fall asleep alone in the guest bedroom, missing his presence. But they made it work, because what they had was worth the effort. And slowly, carefully, they built something that felt sustainable, not perfect, but real and honest and mutual. 3 months after that first council meeting, Vasilika requested a private audience with Xerxes, and he arrived at her residence, a converted monastery outside the city, with some trepidation. She received him in a sitting room that looked medieval and comfortable, and she poured him a glass of blood wine before settling into a chair across from him. How is your mortal? She asked without preamble. Her name is Genevieve, Xerxes said mildly, and she's well. Her research is going better than expected. The council has been watching your rule these past months, Vasilika continued, observing how you balance your relationship with your duties. And your conclusion? That Lysander was right. You're more stable, more patient, more willing to compromise. Whatever she's giving you, it's working. Vasilika took a sip of her wine. I came to offer an apology. I was wrong to call your care for her debasing. It's clear that what you share is partnership, not servitude. Xerxes felt something tight in his chest loosen. Thank you. That means more than you know. I've been alive a very long time, Vasilika said quietly, and I've seen countless vampires lose themselves in power, in pride, in the conviction that they're above connection. You were heading that direction before you met her. She pulled you back. She gave me a reason to be present. Xerxes agreed, a reason to care about something beyond maintaining control. Then for that alone, she has my respect. Vasilika set down her glass. There's another matter. The court is discussing the possibility of extending protection to her, making her formally recognized as the king's consort, which would grant her certain rights and protections under vampire law. Xerxes went very still. The council would support that. A majority would. There is precedent for human consorts, though it's rare in the modern era. But if you're serious about building a life with her, it would be wise to formalize her status. It would prevent other vampires from viewing her as prey or leverage. I'll discuss it with her, Xerxes said, but thank you for considering it, for supporting this. Don't thank me yet, Vasilika said with a slight smile. There will be conditions, rituals, oaths. It won't be simple. Nothing worth having ever is. He brought up the idea that night. While they were curled together on the sofa in the library, Genevieve reading a book on Victorian architecture, while Xerxes ran his fingers through her hair. The council wants to formalize your status, he said, as my consort. She looked up from her book. What does that mean exactly? It means you'd be recognized under vampire law as someone under my protection. Other vampires couldn't harm you or use you as leverage without facing severe consequences. It would also grant you certain rights, access to safe houses, protection from other supernatural creatures, legal standing in vampire courts. That sounds intense. It is. And there would be rituals, oaths you'd have to swear, promises of discretion, loyalty to the court. It's not something to take lightly. Genevieve set her book aside and shifted to face him fully. Would it change things between us? It would formalize them. Make it clear to everyone in vampire society that you're mine and I'm yours. Yours, she repeated, testing the word. I like the sound of that, but only if you're mine too. I've been yours since the moment you fell asleep on this sofa, and I realized I'd found something I'd forgotten how to want. Xerxes said seriously, nothing could change that. Then yes, let's do it. Make it official. The ritual took place a week later in the formal chamber where Genevieve had first met the council. But this time, the room was decorated with elaborate symbols drawn in silver and blood, and there were witnesses, members of the court, ancient vampires who traveled from across the continent to observe. Genevieve stood before the council in a dress Xerxes had given her, deep red silk that felt like liquid against her skin, and she tried not to be intimidated by the sheer age and power gathered in the room. Vasilika led the ritual, speaking in a language that sounded like Latin, but older, and Genevieve repeated the oaths she'd been taught, promises to keep vampire secrets, to honor court law, to stand beside Xerxes as his partner and equal. When it came time for Xerxes to speak his oaths, he took her hands and looked into her eyes with an intensity that made the rest of the room disappear. "I swear to protect you with all that I am," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber, "to honor your autonomy and respect your choices, to build a life with you that reflects both our needs, both our hearts. I swear to love you not as a possession or a subject, but as my partner, my equal, my choice. From this night forward, you are my consort, and I am yours to command." Genevieve felt tears prick her eyes, because those weren't the words Vasilika had taught him, those were his own, offered freely in front of everyone who mattered to him. "I accept your oaths," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion, "and I offer mine in return. I'll stand with you, protect what you've built, and love you without reservation. From this night forward, we're bound." Vasilika drew a silver blade across her palm. Genevieve flinched but didn't pull away and let 3 drops of blood fall onto the symbols drawn on the floor. Then she took Xerxes' hand and did the same, mingling their blood with Genevieve's. "By blood and oath, by choice and promise, I recognize this bond," Vasilika intoned. "Genevieve Grayson, you are consort to the king of the Eastern Court. May you bring him wisdom, strength, and joy." The assembled vampires repeated the blessing, their voices raising in a harmony that sounded ancient and sacred, and then it was done. Genevieve was officially, formally, bound to Xerxes in the eyes of vampire law. He kissed her in front of everyone, a brief but passionate claim, and she kissed him back, feeling the rightness of it settle into her bones. That night, they didn't go back to his house immediately. Instead, Xerxes took her to a rooftop garden he'd cultivated in secret, a hidden space in the heart of the city where moonlight filtered through carefully tended trees, and the sound of traffic was a distant hum. "I wanted to show you this," he said, leading her to a bench surrounded by night-blooming flowers. "I've been coming here for decades when I need to think, to remember what it feels like to be connected to living things." "It's beautiful," Genevieve said, looking around in wonder. "How is this even possible in the middle of the city?" "Money and patience," he said with a slight smile, "and a willingness to wait decades for trees to grow." They sat together and Xerxes pulled her close, wrapping his coat around her shoulders against the cool night air. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "That ritual was intense, and I know you've been processing a lot." "I'm good," she said honestly. "It felt right, making it official. And your oaths, those weren't what we rehearsed. No, those were what I wanted to promise you, not what the court expected to hear." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You're my equal, Genevieve, not my subject. I needed everyone to know that. Thank you," she whispered, "for choosing me, for building this with me." "Thank you for letting me," he replied, "for trusting me enough to tie your life to mine." They stayed there until dawn approached, talking quietly about the future where they saw this relationship going, what it would mean to build a life together when their lifespans were so different, whether she'd ever consider being turned if that was something she wanted. "I don't know," Genevieve admitted when he asked. "Right now, I like being human. I like sleep and sunlight and the normal progression of time. But maybe, someday, if I've lived enough of a mortal life and I'm ready for something different, maybe then I'd consider it." "There's no pressure," Xerxes assured her. "I'll love you, mortal or vampire, for however long we have. That's enough for me." "It's enough for me, too," she said, and she meant it. 6 months after the binding ritual, Genevieve finished her dissertation and defended it successfully, earning her doctorate. Xerxes attended the defense, sitting in the back of the room in dark glasses and carefully avoiding direct sunlight, and when she emerged victorious, he was the first to congratulate her. "Dr. Grayson," he said, pride evident in his voice. "It has a nice ring to it." "It does, doesn't it?" She was grinning, exhausted and exhilarated. "I can't believe I actually did it." "I never doubted you for a moment." They celebrated that night with a small gathering: Genevieve's family, a few of her academic friends, and Lysander, representing the vampire court. Xerxes had been nervous about meeting her family, but her parents turned out to be warm and welcoming, if a bit bemused by their daughter's mysterious boyfriend who only appeared after dark. He works unusual hours, Genevieve had explained, and her mother had simply smiled and said, "As long as he makes you happy, sweetheart, that's all that matters." Later, after the guests had left and they were alone in the library, Genevieve curled up on the sofa, the same sofa where she'd first fallen asleep in Xerxes' presence, and looked at him with soft contentment. "This has been the best year of my life," she said, "even with all the weirdness and danger and vampire politics. Even knowing what I am." Xerxes settled into his chair across from her, a book in his hands, but his attention entirely on her. "No regrets?" "No regrets," she confirmed. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. You gave me rest when I thought I'd never sleep again. You gave me love when I wasn't looking for it, and you gave me a life that's strange and magical and utterly mine. Ours," he corrected gently. "A life that's ours." "Ours," she agreed, her eyes already drifting closed. "Will you read to me?" "Always." He opened his book and began to read, his voice low and soothing, and Genevieve felt herself slipping into that familiar peace, the complete trust that let her surrender to sleep. Xerxes read for an hour, watching as her breathing deepened and evened, as her face relaxed into perfect tranquility. When dawn began to approach, he carefully set his book aside and moved to the sofa, gathering her into his arms. But instead of carrying her upstairs immediately, he simply held her, memorizing the weight of her in his embrace, the warmth of her skin, the soft sounds of her breathing. He'd been doing this for over a year now, watching her sleep, guarding her rest, finding peace in her presence, and it never got old. If anything, it became more precious with each passing night, because he understood how rare this was, how unlikely they were, how easily he could have missed her entirely. Finally, he carried her upstairs to the bedroom they now shared. She'd moved fully into his house months ago, turning the guest room into an office for her research, and laid her carefully on the bed. He stretched out beside her, close enough to feel her warmth, and let himself enter that deep rest he'd discovered with her, the kind that actually restored something fundamental in his ancient soul. Outside, the sun rose over the city, bringing dawn to the mortal world. But in the darkness of their bedroom, with heavy curtains blocking all light, two people rested together, one mortal, one immortal, both finally at peace. Time passed, seasons changed. Genevieve took a position teaching at the university, bringing art history to life for students who reminded her of herself at that age, passionate, curious, hungry for knowledge. Xerxes continued to rule his court with increased wisdom and patience, balancing vampire politics with a newfound understanding of what truly mattered. They built a life that was unconventional, but theirs, navigating the complications of a mortal-immortal relationship with honesty and love. There were hard moments when Genevieve got sick, and Xerxes paced like a caged animal, helpless to heal her, when vampire threats emerged and she had to trust him to handle dangers she couldn't even comprehend. When they disagreed about whether she should attend court functions or stay safely away from vampire politics, but they worked through all of it, because they'd built their foundation on trust and vulnerability and the willingness to be equals, even when their circumstances were wildly different. 3 years after they'd met, Xerxes took Genevieve back to the rooftop garden where he'd brought her after the binding ritual, and he knelt before her with a ring that had belonged to his mortal mother 600 years ago. "I know we're already bound by vampire law," he said, looking up at her with love and hope in his ancient eyes. "But I want to marry you in the human tradition too. I want to stand before your family and friends and promise to love you for as long as you'll have me. Will you marry me, Genevieve?" "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, absolutely yes." They married in a small ceremony in the garden behind his house at sunset so that Xerxes could stand in the fading light without harm. Genevieve wore a simple white dress, and Xerxes wore the formal clothing of his mortal era, and when they exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye among their guests, mortal and vampire alike. "I promise to guard your rest and honor your autonomy," Xerxes said, holding both her hands, "to love you in all your humanity, all your strength, all your beautiful mortality. You are my peace, my partner, my heart. I promise to trust your strength and celebrate your vulnerability." Genevieve replied, to love you in all your immortality, all your complexity, all your careful kindness. You are my safety, my partner, my soul." They kissed as the last light faded from the sky, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird sang. The years that followed were good ones. Genevieve's career flourished, and she became known in academic circles for her innovative approaches to understanding Gothic architecture and restoration. Xerxes' court stabilized further, and his reputation as a fair but formidable king grew stronger. And every night, Genevieve would come home to the library where this had all started, and she would curl up on that leather sofa, and Xerxes would read to her until she drifted into peaceful sleep. He never tired of watching her rest, never stopped feeling grateful that she trusted him enough to be completely vulnerable in his presence. And on the nights when court business didn't call and the world was quiet, he would carry her upstairs and rest beside her, letting her steady, breathing, and warm presence remind him what it meant to be alive, even in undeath. When Genevieve turned 35, they had their first serious conversation about her eventual mortality, about what would happen when she aged and he didn't. When time finally claimed her in a way it never would claim him. "I don't want to lose you," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. They were lying in bed, the darkness complete and safe around them. "The thought of existing without you? Then turn me," she interrupted gently. "When I'm ready, when I've lived enough mortal years to feel complete, turn me, let me stay with you." He'd gone very still. "You'd want that? To become what I am?" "I'd want to stay with you," she corrected. "The method is secondary to the goal, and honestly, the thought of sleeping through centuries at your side sounds pretty good." "Vampires don't sleep the way mortals do." "But you do now," she pointed out. "You've learned how to truly rest because I taught you. Imagine what we could learn together if we had forever." He'd kissed her then, deep and desperate and grateful, and they'd agreed to revisit the conversation when she turned 40, when she'd had time to live a full mortal life and was ready for whatever came next. But before that, before Genevieve turned 40, something unexpected happened. She got pregnant. It shouldn't have been possible. Vampire-human reproduction was supposed to be impossible. Something about incompatible biology, but somehow, against all odds, Genevieve and Xerxes had created a life together. The pregnancy was difficult and closely monitored by the handful of vampire physicians who had any experience with such things. Xerxes was terrified for Genevieve's safety, hovering constantly until she had to gently but firmly tell him to back off and let her breathe. "I'm not made of glass," she said. "And this baby is half yours, which means she's going to be strong. Trust that." "She?" Xerxes had looked at her with sudden hope. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. We're having a daughter." A daughter. The concept had nearly brought Xerxes to his knees. He'd never imagined he'd be a father, had given up that possibility when he'd been turned 600 years ago. And now Genevieve was giving him something he'd thought lost forever: a child, a future, a continuation of himself. The birth was hard, but Genevieve was harder, and when their daughter finally arrived, tiny and perfect, with a shock of white hair and her mother's dark eyes, Xerxes held her with hands that trembled. "Draga," Genevieve murmured from the bed, exhausted but smiling. "Her name is Draga. It means precious." "Draga," Xerxes repeated, and the baby opened her eyes and looked at him with awareness that seemed far beyond newborn consciousness. "Hello, little one. Welcome to your strange, beautiful life." Draga grew quickly, showing signs of both her heritage's human warmth and appetite for life, vampire strength, and heightened senses. She was a happy child, curious and fearless, and she loved nothing more than curling up between her parents while Xerxes read aloud from his vast library. "She has your love of stories," Genevieve observed one night, watching their 3-year-old daughter fight sleep while listening to a fairy tale. "And your stubbornness," Xerxes replied fondly. "She refuses to admit when she's tired." "I wonder where she gets that from," Genevieve teased, and he huffed a laugh. When Draga finally succumbed to sleep, Xerxes carried her to her bedroom, decorated with both modern toys and antique treasures, because their daughter had the run of the house and neither parent could deny her anything, and tucked her in carefully. Then he returned to the library where Genevieve was waiting on their sofa, and he settled beside her with a contentment that had taken centuries to find. "Do you remember the first night you fell asleep here?" he asked, pulling her close. "Of course. I remember thinking I'd finally found somewhere safe enough to let my guard down." She looked up at him. "I didn't know then that I'd found home." "Neither did I," Xerxes admitted. "I thought I was just helping someone in need. I didn't realize I was the one who needed help, that I'd been sleepwalking through centuries, just existing, until you taught me how to be present." "We saved each other." Genevieve said softly. That's how the best love stories work. Is that what this is? A love story? The best one I know. He kissed her, then slow and sweet and full of promise, and when they finally pulled apart, Genevieve yawned. Time for bed? Xerxes asked. Time for rest, she corrected. Both of us. They went upstairs to their bedroom, where blackout curtains kept the coming dawn at bay, and they lay down together in the darkness that had become their sanctuary. Xerxes wrapped his arms around Genevieve, feeling her warmth and weight and presence, and he let himself sink into that deep rest he'd learned from her, the kind that actually restored his soul, not just his body. And as he drifted, he thought about how strange and wonderful it was that a chance encounter in a cafe had led to this, to love and marriage and fatherhood, to partnership and vulnerability and true rest. He thought about Genevieve's peaceful face the first time she'd fallen asleep in his library, how he'd memorized every detail until dawn forced him away. And he thought about how he'd been memorizing her every night since, storing away moments and expressions and small intimacies, building a catalog of their life together that would last as long as his immortal memory. But now, instead of watching from across the room, he got to hold her while they both rested. Instead of guarding her sleep from a distance, he got to be equally vulnerable, equally at peace. Instead of protecting without being protected in return, he had a partner who saw him completely and loved him anyway. Genevieve's breathing evened out, slipping into sleep, and Xerxes followed her down into rest, trusting her to guard him the way he guarded her. Outside, dawn broke over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. But in their sun-shielded bedroom, in the darkness they'd built together, two people slept deeply and peacefully, vampire and mortal, king and consort, partners in every way that mattered. And in the room down the hall, their daughter Draga dreamed of fairy tales and adventures, safe in the knowledge that she was loved and protected by parents who'd chosen each other against all odds. Years from now, when Genevieve was ready, she would accept Xerxes' gift of immortality, and they would have literal forever together. They would watch Draga grow into her own power, would rule the court side by side, would build a legacy that honored both their heritages. But for now, in this moment, they had exactly what they needed: each other, their daughter, and the rare, precious peace that came from being completely known and completely loved. Xerxes pulled Genevieve closer in his sleep, and she murmured something incoherent but content, and they rested together as the sun rose on another day they'd built together. It wasn't a perfect life. There were still challenges ahead, still conflicts to navigate, still the reality of vampire politics and mortal complications to balance. But it was their life, chosen and cherished and fought for, and that made all the difference. In the end, the greatest gift they gave each other wasn't protection or power or even immortality. It was the gift of rest, the ability to lay down their guards, to be vulnerable, to trust completely in the presence of the other. It was the gift of being seen, being known, being loved for exactly who they were. And it was the gift of home, not a place, but a person, a presence, a peace that existed whenever they were together. Xerxes had spent 600 years searching for something he couldn't name, and he'd found it in an exhausted woman who'd fallen asleep on his sofa while he read. Genevieve had spent years unable to rest, and she'd found peace in a vampire king who watched over her sleep like it was the most important task in the world. Together, they'd built something neither had thought possible, a love that transcended mortality and immortality, power and vulnerability, danger and safety. They'd built a home in each other's arms, and they learned to rest, truly rest in the certainty that they were loved. And every night, until forever claimed them both, they would fall asleep together in their sun-shielded sanctuary, holding each other close, breathing in tandem, perfectly at peace. The vampire king who'd memorized his beloved's peaceful face until dawn had finally learned that he didn't need to watch from a distance anymore. He could close his eyes and rest beside her, trusting her to keep him safe the way he kept her safe. And in that mutual vulnerability, that complete trust, they found something rarer than immortality and more precious than power. They found each other, and they found home, and they found rest. And that was more than enough. That was everything.